Hello and welcome to Dialogue. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has been on a week-long official trip to Vietnam, Cambodia, Singapore and South Korea at the invitation of these countries' officials. Coming soon after the U.S. Vice President's trip, what are China's hopes for this visit to the Asian countries? And with the DPRK having just conducted a new missile test, what will be on the agenda specifically for the Korean Peninsula? To find out more, I'm glad to be joined by Victor Gao Zhikai, Chair Professor of Suzhou University, Chiang Van-Ris, President of the Asian Vision Institute, Shen Han, a correspondent in Seoul, and Professor Robert Kelly from the Department of Political Science at the Korea's Pusan National University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Shen, start with you. Wang Yi is arriving in Seoul. So what's on his agenda to South Korea?
Well, most certainly getting discussions and dialogue back to the forefront with regards to the DPRK and a nuclear-free Korean Peninsula will undoubtedly be high on the agenda. That, as well as issues of bilateral concern between Seoul and Beijing. Next year happens to mark 3 decades of formal diplomatic ties between the two sides. But as far as how South Korea positions itself in the grand scheme of things, in terms of the DPRK, Seoul has a direct vested interest in seeing the U.S. and China maintain amicable relations. China is a very important trading partner for South Korea, as well as the U.S. is an important ally as well. How much influence Seoul has on China-U.S. matters, you could argue, is negligible, but it shouldn't be a zero-sum game where if Seoul aligns itself with one side on one issue, that will affect relations with the other. Rather, I think South Korea has more to gain by tackling each issue under the grand scheme of things and try to get the support of both sides, especially on issues like the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And that's going to be a major point of concern for South Korea during Mr. Wang's visit here to get Beijing support in restarting these nuclear talks.
Speak of this nuclear talks or the Korean Peninsula, the nuclear issue, this has been there for a long time. So, reportedly, North Korea has conducted this long-range cruise missile test. So what's the response from South Korea, as far as you know?
Yeah, I'd say so far the response has been relatively muted. Officials here say they're working with U.S. intelligence officials to analyze this latest test, but when they were asked if or when they were aware of this recent missile launch, they've been rather coy. Perhaps the reason we're not seeing the widespread condemnation we're used to seeing is because this was a cruise missile launch and not a ballistic missile test, which is explicitly banned under current UN sanctions. Now, that doesn't mean that South Korea doesn't view this latest launch as a threat. In fact, DPRK media called this launch a new, quote, strategic test, possibly implying that it can later be developed to deliver a nuclear warhead, perhaps. The DPRK's leader, Kim Jong-un, wasn't present at this latest launch. Some experts say Pyongyang is using it as a strategic maneuvering tactic while diplomacy and discussions are happening. And it could also be seen as a response to the recent joint South Korea-U.S. military drills, with which we know the DPRK is never pleased with. But at the very least, it certainly doesn't help toward the ultimate goal of denuclearization, where any sort of progress has been stalled over the past several years.
We know there's meetings, among officials from South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. in Japan. So how much do we know about that? Any concrete result in how to deal with the Korean situation?
We're still getting details now. Details are just coming in from those meetings that happened in Tokyo over the past several days. But in conclusion, I don't think any party here involved is hoping for any escalation in tensions in this region. I think one reason we haven't seen any escalations possibly is because Pyongyang has been focusing on domestic issues like the COVID pandemic, as well as economic issues internally. We saw the midnight parade that was held last week being toned down compared to past years. That comes amid the backdrop of recent reports that the DPRK has restarted a plutonium reactor. But as far as the outcome of those talks, those trilateral talks in Tokyo, the U.S.'s representative, Sung Kim, repeated comments he has made before that the U.S. has no hostile intent toward Pyongyang, and he hopes the DPRK will respond positively to sit down and meet without any preconditions. The South Korean side also suggested that a way to engage the DPRK is possibly through humanitarian means. No details were provided on that, but whether that can happen, we'll have to see without any easing of sanctions on Pyongyang. But again, any approach on denuclearization would have to include China and possibly even Russia as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens and what comes of this flurry of diplomacy, including Mr. Wang Yi's upcoming schedule here in Seoul.
Professor Robert Kelly, are we clear right now, like 8 months into this Biden administration? So what's the Biden's policy towards North Korea?
Yeah, I think if you actually look at the North Korea review that the Biden people put out, everybody sort of ignored it. But if you actually read it, I think it actually gets back to basically what President Obama was doing about North Korea, which is, we'll talk to you, but until then, it's basically deterrence and containment, working with allies, South Korea and Japan, most obviously, right? Maybe trying to pull China in to help us out a little bit. But it's a fairly sort of status quo approach, just kind of slow and steady approach. If you go, I think the Biden people really think that the Trump administration got burned by North Korea, that the North Koreans sort of led the Trump administration around and didn't give them anything serious, while Trump gave the North Koreans a lot of attention and legitimacy, particularly in meeting an American president face to face 3 times. And so I think the Biden people are willing to talk to North Korea, but there's so much else going on for the Biden administration that until the North Koreans come up with something more substantial than they offered Donald Trump at Hanoi in 2019, I don't think the Biden people are going to make any big initiatives.
What about the latest missile test, let's say? And, given this increasing tension between U.S. and China amid the geopolitical competition, how will that affect this, in what way they are going to deal with that, affect the possible cooperation between China and the U.S. in dealing with the Korean Peninsula, this nuclear issue?
Yeah, so the cruise missile test, I don't think actually impacts America's relationship with North Korea that much, if only because the cruise missile is medium range. It really affects Japan, right? I mean, if you can actually put a nuke on it, which is sort of up for debate, the North Koreans are saying it's so, with the range that it has, it looks like it can strike most of Japan. That includes, I should say, in passing Okinawa, where, of course, the United States has a lot of forces, but it cannot reach Guam. So I'm not really sure that it affects the relationship with the United States that much, except filtered through allies. The larger issue, though, of sort of Sino-U.S. competition in East Asia, that's really unfortunate regarding North Korea, because if China and the United States work together, we can actually bring a fair amount of pressure to bear on North Korea, right? As we all know, a lot of North Korean, most of North Korean trade goes through China. North Korea's banking activities go through China as well, right? There's been sort of a big discussion in the United States about 15 years or so, going back to the Obama administration, about how much the United States should actually pressure Chinese banks to sort of close North Korean accounts. This has been sort of a really hot topic. And as U.S.-China relations get worse, it's going to get harder and harder for the Americans and Chinese to cooperate on North Korea. That's ironic because both the United States and China actually have a pretty strong interest in preventing a spiraling, untransparent, unaccountable, unobserved North Korean nuclear program, right? And we all want to get inspectors in there. We all want them to cap and slow down. And so the U.S. and China should actually be able to work on this, but they won't, which is too bad.
Very unfortunate, right? One of the victims of this rising rivalry, or you can say like a new Cold War over there. Before Wang Yi obviously starting his trip to Korea, he has been spending most of the time in the Southeast Asia or ASEAN countries. So let me bring in Chiang Van Ries. Mr. Chiang Van Ries, this year also marks the China-ASEAN, the dialogue relationship for the 30th anniversary, actually, from 1991 to 2021. If you look at their trade relationship between the two sides, it's amazing to see, the growth in leaps and bounds. And ASEAN has become the largest trading partner of China. Of course, China has been the largest trading partner for ASEAN, I believe, for at least like a consecutive 12 years. How do you make of this relationship?
As you said, this year marks the 30th anniversary of China-ASEAN strategic partnership, and China is willing to upgrade this partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership in coming years. So the visits to Vietnam, Cambodia, and Singapore really signify China kind of strong political will and commitment to further deepen China-Southeast Asia relation. And within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, China has offered tremendous support to Southeast Asian country because, China is not safe if Southeast Asian are not safe. So vice versa. So we need to offer mutual support in fighting against the pandemic and work together to recover from this pandemic. In his trip to Singapore, one of the key highlights here is the cooperation on digital economy. So I think this kind of digital transformation, digitalization, international cooperation on creating norms on digital economy would be very significant for China-ASEAN cooperation moving forward, especially in the post-COVID era.
Well, Victor, Foreign Minister Wang Yi started his visit with Vietnam. Obviously, the two countries, China and Vietnam, they enjoy this similar political system culturally, and also both countries obviously are dealing with this pandemic control. And despite the disputes in the South China Sea, I think the countries in ASEAN and also China in this region, basically, people would love to see stability and peace, more trade, more investment, and that's the common interest. This visit obviously comes against the background of the visit by the U.S. officials, including Vice President Kamala Harris over there. Is that possible also to bring in the U.S. actually and to contribute to, say, pandemic control and also more trade, more investment, more peace and stability here?
Well, first of all, I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to Vietnam is very important because Vietnam and China really share a lot of things. In terms of political system, for example, there is also very much of a similarity between the two countries. So, in a sense, Vietnam and China can learn from each other, from the successes and failures, experiences of how to promote reform and opening to the outside world. Now, as far as U.S.'s role is concerned for Vietnam, there is a concern that the United States has an ulterior motive for Vietnam. It wants to sign up Vietnam onto the bandwagon of the United States against China. This is easy said than done, though, because China and Vietnam, after all, are neighboring countries. We share very long land boundary as well as maritime boundary. So it is difficult for any other country try to incite hatred between China and Vietnam and turn their relations into a hostility relations. However, I think both China and Vietnam need to guard against such instinctive impulses on the part of the United States. And I think this has been clear from Vice President Harris's visit to Vietnam. It's very obvious that the United States has this particular agenda of pulling Vietnam into its orbit against China. So I think the more China and Vietnam talk to each other, the better. And I think Wang Yi has achieved this goal. The two countries not only can cooperate a lot in terms of fighting against COVID-19 pandemic, but in terms of economic development, because China and Vietnam are right now at a little bit of different stages of their industrialization. And if both countries do the right thing, there can be actually migration of factories in China into Vietnam, which can ironically be working for the mutual benefit of both countries in this particular regard.
Well, Robert, what is the U.S. priority for ASEAN for this Southeast Asia region, let's say?
Yeah, the United States' relationship with ASEAN has been pretty mixed for a while, right? I mean, in part, ASEAN was designed to push the Americans and the Chinese out of the region, right? I mean, ASEAN is sort of where things like the non-aligned movement began, all those years ago, 40 or 50 years ago, and the idea was to push us all out of the way so that locals could determine their own future. I don't actually think the United States has any major big strategic goals in ASEAN other than to sort of push back on China in the South China Sea, right? I mean, the 9-dash line is obviously very controversial. The United States doesn't accept it. Most of their countries in Southeast Asia don't either. And so those countries have sort of an interest in actually keeping the Americans in the region, in part to push back on China. As your other guests have sort of pointed out, I think most of these countries don't actually want to choose openly between China and the United States, right? I mean, the Philippines has made that very obvious. I think the Vietnamese are in the same position, right? But to the extent that they think that China's pushing them, they're going to tilt towards the United States and vice versa. But I don't think the United States has any sort of major grand strategic initiative for Southeast Asia. I would sort of discourage that thinking as sort of unnecessarily conspiratorial or sort of like reading the United States as trying to contain China. The United States may get to containing China in 10 years, but I think it's premature to use that language now.
But also, to be frank, if you look at the disputes, it's not like between China and ASEAN. It's actually there are tensions, among countries within ASEAN. But at the same time, countries agree, like, let's resolve the issue through peaceful means, through negotiation, through, code of conduct, for example. But the U.S. obviously is not one of the claimant.
Yeah, that's correct, right? I mean, the United States actually doesn't have which is probably one of the reasons why the U.S. and China haven't actually had a serious collision in the South China Sea. The United States has no direct territorial interests in it, right? But in the West, the South China Sea is increasingly read as a trial balloon for China's behavior on its periphery, right? I think one of the reasons why the Chinese are pushing in the South China Sea as opposed to elsewhere is because it's a maritime perimeter where the stakes are a lot lower. It's a lot less clear who controls what. Many of these islands that we're talking about, like Scarborough and the Parasols and Fiery Cross, these are very, very small, right? So there's just no way that sort of like countries are going to go and sort of get into a big collision and then start shooting at each other over these really, really sort of, small outcomes. And that's actually that's why it's a sort of a shadow zone, right? It's kind of this gray zone where the Chinese make these claims and the Americans sail the ships through on freedom of navigation operations, right? Because neither side actually really wants to, really seriously use force when the stakes are so low. And this will probably be the foremost area for the U.S. and China to compete territorially in the future because of that.
Mr. Chiang Van Ries, in the visit to Cambodia, Foreign Minister Wang Yi expressed the hope that next year, during this chairmanship of Cambodia of ASEAN, the countries can finish their negotiation of the code of conduct. So all this South China Sea will remain peaceful. So countries will not have a problem over these different claims over there. So what is the expectation of the negotiation? Obviously, because of the pandemic, it's slowed down a little bit this year in particular. So are we hoping to see the completion of the negotiation next year?
It's hard to predict, actually. Second reading is ongoing, and we expect that some of the key points, differences can be concluded or can be reached consensus next year, so it can be concluded. So that is the wish, that is the hope that Cambodia has as a chair of ASEAN next year, because it will mark the 30th anniversary of the DOC as well. After it signed 30 years ago, the declaration of the code of the implementation of in the South China Sea. So that is something that I think ASEAN and China have shown strong commitment toward the early conclusion of the COC, because it will be a key mechanism, one of the key mechanisms to maintain peace and stability in this region. And I would like to stress also that Cambodia is a kind of iron-clad friend of China, which is very close to China, and that was expressed by the visit of Wang Yi and the body language, and the key message has been expressed in Phnom Penh. So China is going to support Cambodia chairmanship ASEAN to ensure that it will be a successful chairmanship next year.
Obviously, China enjoys this strong relationship, obviously with basically every country in ASEAN, 10 of them, despite disputes with some of them among them. So for the U.S. participation or U.S. presence, obviously South China Sea is one of the at least the issue, the site, say, somehow there's a stake, there's interest for the U.S. to get involved, for example, freedom of navigation. But the freedom of navigation, Victor, is two issues, seems to me at least. If you look at the freedom of navigation for commercial ships, there's no issue, no problem, because China is the country, actually. You have goods coming in and out, the largest stakeholder. Of course, China would be the one which hates the most to see any disruption of the shipping lane. And of course, when it comes to aircraft carrier, it's a different story.
Well, first of all, allow me to put it for the record that over the past several decades, there has never been any interruption of freedom of navigation for both commercial navigation as well as military navigation. What China is against is not freedom of navigation. It is sailing of warships or submarines in the South China Sea to provoke China, to threaten China's territorial integrity, to incurse into Chinese territorial sea, for example, and to approach the Chinese coastline to do all kinds of reconnaissance. Now, it is very important to note that for the past several years, 3 Chinese naval ships have surfaced in the so-called exclusive economic zone in Alaska off the Aleutian Islands. Now, this is very rare, but I think this sends a message to the Americans that if you keep irritating China in the South China Sea, under the banner of freedom of navigation, the Chinese ships, naval ships, can sail to the offshore area in the United States. Now, this time it is in Alaska. Next time, don't be surprised if it is all the way along the California offshore. And the message is very clear. That is, if you keep pushing into South China Sea, we can push to the American offshore. And I hope the American people will get the message. China does not want to be hostile against the United States. China does not want to waste all the money and resources to send all the ships to American offshore. But if you keep irritating the Chinese national interest, be my guest. I will sail to offshore the United States. And this will apply to U.S. allies. For example, Australia. I will not be surprised if one day Chinese naval ships will sail offshore Sydney. And the Australians should get the message that, okay, don't do all these stupid things to practice so-called freedom of navigation, because freedom of navigation has never been sabotaged or disrupted in the South China Sea. And you are absolutely right. China has a vested interest to make sure that maritime navigation through South China Sea is absolutely not disrupted or hindered or damaged in any sense, because we are the biggest interest holder in the freedom of navigation through the South China Sea.
Well, if we put aside this South China Sea, if you look at a more important issue like forward-looking, for example, this RCEP, I think in Wang Yi's stop in Singapore, he also asked for China to apply for membership of a TPP, like this comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's in addition to RCEP. For those who are not familiar with RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That's basically ASEAN 10 countries plus 5, China, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Chiang, one is, how important is RCEP, which is to begin to become effective early next year?
Yes, I think RCEP is a catalyst for economic recovery, integration. It's about 30% of global GDP and about 30% of world population. It's a huge market and huge in terms of consumption power here in this region. And of course, China is kind of regarded as an engine or a locomotive of this kind of regional integration. And the parliaments across the region some of them have already ratified the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and expectedly it will be implemented from early next year when Cambodia chair ASEAN. RCEP will be one of the key deliverables of a Cambodia chairmanship because we believe in economic integration.
Mm-hmm. And speak of economic integration, free trade, liberalization, Robert, in recent years we hear little and little, about globalization, about free trade. Why can't we, all the countries focus on trade and trade more with each other and create more peaceful and more stronger relationship among the people and the business community? So what is like thinking or the rationale like for the Biden administration? Are they ready to do more trade with this region, with China or with ASEAN countries?
Well, they are with the region except for China. I mean, that's the issue, right? I mean, ultimately, politics trumps economics, right? That is to say that the strategic relationship with China and the United States, right, over the South China Sea, North Korea, East China Sea, Senkaku, all these sorts of issues, right? That will ultimately structure the economic relationship, right? If there's geopolitical tension, that will filter down into the economic relationship. That is very unfortunate. That does have the impact that you just said, right, of sort of reducing the material prosperity of everyone involved. Both the United States and China benefit. We've all become wealthier to the extent that we permit trade and allow the free play of comparative advantage. That will all be lost as these two economies begin to delink, that which I think both sides are actually talking about, certainly the Americans are. Delinkage will take a long time, right? The American business community actually doesn't really want that too much, right? I mean, companies like Apple and, Microsoft and others that have big investments in China have actually pushed back on this idea that we should sort of slide into a Cold War with China. But, the business community doesn't set national policy. They just don't, right? And so in time, right, if the strategic relationship doesn't improve, and I think there are ways to do that, like I said, cooperation on North Korea, for example. But if it doesn't, if their strategic relationship worsens, then eventually the economic relationship will follow, and that's why the Biden people aren't rolling back the tariffs on China. I think the Biden people would actually probably like to have greater trade engagement with the America's allies in the region, but that's kind of difficult because the Biden's coalition includes labor unions and stuff like that that are hostile to trade generally. So I actually don't think the Biden people will do much on trade in Asia at all, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, Rob, Victor, you want to respond?
Well, first of all, this D-Link idea is completely an absurd idea. First of all, it's against the interest of the American people. Secondly, it's against the interest of the Chinese people. Then thirdly, equally importantly, it is against the interest of world peace and stability. So I would say anyone really pushing for a D-Link between China and the United States, first of all, they are indulging in fantasy. They cannot achieve this goal. Secondly, they are really bringing about damage to the fundamental interests of the American people. So these people should be liable for lots of things, and they should suffer the consequences. Now, another point I think is very important. That is, if anyone in the United States still believe that they should have a segmented China-U.S. relations, that is, they can pick and choose. They can say, okay, cooperate between China and the United States on DPRK, but then let me confront you on other issues. No way. From the Chinese perspective, there is only one China-U.S. relations. If you want to be friendly with me, we can be friendly with you on across the board, on all issues. If you want to be hostile against me, wait for my hostility across the issues. So don't pick and choose. Don't have the cake and eat it. Only one China-U.S. relations. And I think in Alaska meeting, in Tianjin meeting, China has made the point very clear. Don't pick and choose. Tell me, what do you want to do? You want to be friendly or you want to be hostile? Be my guest. You pick and choose.
Yeah.
May I respond to that?
Robert, you want to respond? Go ahead.
Just briefly. If we connect every issue between the U.S. and China into one big super package, right, all of that will be structured by the strategic relationship at the top, which is going to become competitive, and that will then filter down and ruin everything. That, in my opinion, is a recipe for disaster. That throws out all the possible areas where the U.S. and China can cooperate: trade, finance, North Korea, climate change, COVID. There are a lot of areas where we can work together that don't, if we can just bracket the strategic issues, if we tie everything into a big ball, we're going to slide right into the Cold War we should all want to avoid. I think that's an enormous error.
But also, Robert, can you deny that if you compete fiercely in one area or multiple area, and that would create a lot of bad blood between the two countries, how can you cooperate in selected area, let's say, climate change? Obviously, it will affect your cooperation.
That's right. No, I don't disagree with that. I mean, that's the natural sort of inclination, right, is to sort of lump it all together. And I'm saying that if we need to try to not do that, because if we don't, then we're going to slide right into this Cold War that we should all wish to avoid, right? We should try very hard not to allow the South China Sea to structure everything. But, because if we do, we're asking for exactly that great power competition.
That's right. Obviously, we should work all the best to avoid a Cold War. Well, on that note, we come into the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. And also thank you for watching. See you next time.